The Declaration of Human Rights is non-binding, but as you can see, it's being put into our laws as we speak. So then it is binding. It's only non-binding to all the countries that don't infuse it into their courts, and they know it. Even if they ratify it, even if they say, yes, we're going to accept laws 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but we're not going to accept all the rest of them, and they ratify that, even then, they are not bound to it. They are only bound to it when it's put into their own courts. And this is what the New Zealand sneaky government is doing. New Zealand undertook the roadmap to compliance, although not creating binding legal obligations, but I've just already told you all about that. So now you're going to come under the co-governance with the United Nations. Under is consistent with and complements the treaty principles and the duties as described. Well, which treaty are they talking about? If they're talking about the treaty, you've got, which is lawless. It's not bound to any laws. And they're talking about our English treaty, stamped by the Queen. That one is bound by British law. And then this co-governance here can't exist under this treaty. So, because this English treaty forbids foreigners to govern New Zealanders. So the co-governance of the United Nations is going through this. Moving forward, we've seen that so far that the powers that be have taken the Treaty of Waitangi, changed its name into the Treaty. The Treaty of Waitangi is bound by the 1689 Bill of Rights, and it is bound by constitutional law, and the bill is to the Majesty the Queen. And there were many restrictions on governments because of this 1689 Bill of Rights. However, they found a way around it. They changed the Treaty of Waitangi, and they removed the third article, and the third article made all New Zealand native subjects of the Majesty. When they made them subjects of the Majesty, then their country's laws were bound by constitutional law of the 1689 Bill of Rights for Protestants. And what we've seen in New Zealand, now I'm going to show you Australia, Canada. I had no doubt that you're going under this. So I've just found the first law where they have put Australian people underneath this new absolute law where there are no restrictions on how they can change their laws and what they do. So I'm going to show you that in a minute. Australia, Canada, watch out. Watch what's going on with Kate Floss. So this is called the Digital Identity Services. It comes under, if you look it up, AITIA, Global. And I'm going to show you how Australia is going to be dragged under New Zealand law. Who would have thought that they would be able to drag the entire country of Australia under New Zealand customary law? You're going to be really shocked when you see. And the United Nations. I'm telling you, Australia, we're at war. We are definitely and absolutely at war. So what is happening is, after what they're doing, they've got dozens of lawyers in New Zealand choosing any human rights cases that they can find, and they're putting them into the court, and they're using the New Zealand 1990 Bill of Rights, which I told you that Section 19 binds you to more than 1,000 United Nations laws. And in New Zealand, they're working between two laws. One is the restricted Treaty of Waitangi in 1689 Bill of Rights, and one is the unrestricted Te Reti o Waitangi and Aotearoa. One's called New Zealand, One's called Aotearoa, and sometimes you'll see the two of them together. Sometimes you'll see them only use Aotearoa. Sometimes you'll see them only use New Zealand. Sometimes you'll see them use Aotearoa and New Zealand. Sometimes you'll see them use only the Treaty of Waitangi, which is restricted, and sometimes you'll see them use only the treaty, which is unrestricted. So they're moving between all of this lawful society that is bound in legal mandates, and then this customary law where they can change laws anytime, at any stroke of the pen. They can change law as they see fit. And what has happened is that now, if we think of that two law scenario, there's like two houses. All right, let's see it as in two houses. We'll do the houses. So here's one house, and here you've got New Zealand. All right, here you've got New Zealand, right, and then you've got the treaty here, and then you've got the 1689 Bill of Rights. That is, the bill is to the Majesty. To the Majesty. Now this has many restrictions. And then you've got this other house that they've created, the sneaky bastards have created this other house. Now under this, you've got Aotearoa, all right, and then under this, you've got a thing called the treaty. And under the treaty, the third article that binds the treaty to the Majesty, the third article has been removed. All right, so New Zealanders understand that, but some people outside might understand. But all you've got to understand is that we've got two houses here, and this house here is bound in Constitution. And they can't just change laws as they want. They have to get the mandate of the people. But this house here is customary, and they can do pretty much what they like. And they've found this sneaky way. Now, this one is not bound by anything. And they found this sneaky way to join the United Nations over here. And they found a sneaky way to join the United Nations over here too, over with the constitutional law. And the way that they've done it is they've got dozens of lawyers infusing new acts. They've written all these new acts of law since 1993, I think it is, that they've started doing it. And they've had lawyers, they've deliberately caused dozens of environmental abuses, people's rights abuses, dozens of them, and they've got these lawyers going and getting these cases and putting them through the court. Now, the United Nations laws are all supposed to be what we signed up for, was non-binding laws. But what they've done is they have written those acts of the United Nations into domestic law, put it right through to the High Court. And what is happening is that if a United Nations law is in the domestic law, then you are bound to uphold it and pay for it and be responsible for it, right? But once it's in domestic law, whenever they want to make changes, because the United Nations is not non-binding, whenever they want to make changes, they don't have to ask anyone here. They flip over to their non-binding over here, and they can make any changes that they like, and you don't even need to know about them. And wait till you get the end, because I'm going to show you where they've actually written that into a law that's in the process of going through New Zealand Parliament. Now, you might be wondering to yourself, what's this got to do with Australia? What's this got to do with Canada? And I'm going to show you what it's got to do, because for the first time that I have seen, the AI law has put Australia under New Zealand customary law here. All right, let's go and have a look. So this is the new digital law that they're in the process of putting through New Zealand Parliament. And this is where that I told you that the New Zealand 1990 Bill of Rights binds New Zealand through Section 19 to thousands of United Nations laws that they have no control over. And now they've added Australia. This is from Chris Farfoy. Chris Farfoy is a Samoan. He's not even a New Zealander, and he is in New Zealand Parliament writing these laws for New Zealanders. And why do they get a foreigner to write these laws, you wonder? Well, if anything goes pear-shaped and there's any prosecutions, these people with dual citizenship, they can just up and skip country back to their own countries and they don't go to prison. So that's why they're putting all these laws through by non-native New Zealand people. So this is something that we need to look at. As I work to close, I want to also acknowledge that this Digital Trust Framework Bill brings about mutual recognition with the Australian Trusted Digital Identity Framework. Now, you go and look, Australia, at your digital framework and you'll find that you are bound to the United Nations forever. There's an attempt to coordinate to make sure there's interoperability there, and that was a pledge made that there was an intention for this to happen between our Prime Minister and the Australian Prime Minister in 2019 and 2020. Overall, he says it's fantastic news for the future of trade between our nations, that interoperability. Now, you should be careful, Australia, because as I'm just showing you, I'll show you what they've done, that they're working in the two houses. One house is the customary law, where they can change laws at the flip of the hat and they don't even need to tell you. And one house is the constitutional law, where we have rights. You have no rights under customary law, by the way, none. So, what they have done is, in the appendix of the AI law of New Zealand, that, as you can see, Australia is signed up to, they've used this treaty, this Maori version of the treaty that is not sealed by the Queen. It's not bound by any constitutional law. And then they put the English treaty, which is bound by the 1689 Bill of Rights. And then that's just the Maori version. And then what they've done is, this is where they've bound the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights into a co-governance together with the New Zealand Maori. And it's not bound by any constitutions. And what they've said in this law that they're bringing up, it says that first of all, they have to ask, what they have to do is they have to ask the Maori people or a group of people or any ethnic people, whether they be Muslim or Chinese, if what they want to do is suitable for you. And that sounds very good. But then when you get down to here, it says, if it's too complicated for them to ask the people, what they can do is they can get a similar group of people and they can ask that similar group of people how they would feel if this was going to be the data used for them or created about them. And if that group of people, as long as they're the same colour, so they'll take a group of white people, it doesn't say the numbers, so they could take a group of 5 white people, a group of 5 Maori people, a group of 5 Chinese people, a group of 5 Muslim people, pay them off and say, if you agree with this, then since you are of the same similar group as these other groups, then probably all those other groups would agree with it as well. So then they're going to write it into the laws for you. So when you've got the United Nations, which is non-binding, and then you've got the treaty, it's not saying Waitangi, so when you've got the treaty, which is non-binding, and then you've got the country, this invisible country that doesn't exist, called Aotearoa, that's not even on a map, which is non-binding. When they wanted to do something and they get this little small group of people to decide on something for you, then they move all of that and they decide on it all through all of those non-binding places. The United Nations, Aotearoa, which is a fictional place that does not exist, and the treaty, which is non-binding to the constitutional laws of England. So first they will make a small law into your domestic law, which makes you bound to anything that they want to do. And then they shift it from there back into the House where they can make any laws that they want. And since it's in your domestic law, you're bound to it, but you're signing up to things that you have no idea what they are about. Okay. Humans. I don't think I'm going to go into that, but I'll just leave it there. That's just all the different documents that they're working within to deceive our Anglo and non-Anglo people in our Anglo-speaking countries of New Zealand, Australia. Australia, you needn't think that you're immune to this. They're just, everything that they're doing in New Zealand is going to be coming through Australia. They're putting all so-called Indigenous people under the lawless treaty. That's what they're doing. It's a new treaty that's been signed without your knowledge. So they're just implementing it slowly infusing it through the laws. They can't just come with a bombshell and drop it on you. They've got to slowly infuse it into the laws, make one step and then make another step. Make one step, and so they eliminate and add. And that's what they're doing. It's in Australia, it's in Canada, it's everywhere. So the Declaration of Indigenous Rights has another 46 articles. We're not sure if the UNDRIP and the UNDER are the same. Okay, and then there's this other law here, you Maori will know, the Treaty of Waitangi Guidance. Which treaty are they talking about? Well, it's probably a legal entity that works between the two of them to know when you need to use that legal one and when you need to use the customary one to sidestep all the laws. And it's just a very intricate web of activity. And I assume that this is the governance system, I just assuming here, that might be in charge of all that. UNDER is consistent with and complements the treaty principles. The New Zealand government recognises all of these sections of the UNDRIP, which we don't know if it's the same as the UNDER, but it recognises these of the UNDRIP, and I haven't put all of them. What I will tell you is that there are 370 million Indigenous people that are all going to come under these laws through the Maori. So they're using the Maori. Well, why couldn't they all come under the 1689 Bill of Rights? Well, the 1689 Bill of Rights is for Protestants. It's for people that believe that I don't really understand it really, but they believe that, what do they believe? Well, anyway, they don't have the restrictions of Islamic laws. They don't have the restrictions of Jewish law, and they don't have the restriction of Catholic law. The Catholic law put all of our souls under their ownership, and the Jewish law has many laws that you have to follow that Protestants could not follow, and the penalty would be decapitation. And the Islamic law has similar laws where the penalty, if you disobey them, would be decapitation. The Protestants were not able to follow their laws, so the Protestants came up with this law to protect themselves. But all of these 370 million people many of them are under these religions. They're either Jewish or they're Islamic, or they can't follow Protestant mandates. So they came up with the human rights. And what they've done is they're putting them underneath the New Zealand Maori so that they're able to function in some kind of a right system, which I'm going to talk about later. All right, where are we on? I'm almost finished. So some of the articles, here we say that realizing that the individual has duties to the other individuals and to the community which he belongs is under a responsibility to strive for promotion and observance of rights recognized in the present covenants. These are the indigenous rights, and these rights do not belong to Anglo people. But the bill is to the Anglo people. So Article 4 says that Indigenous people, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy and self-government, and as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous. So here's what's happening. In our Anglo countries, they're taking all our non-Anglo people and they're letting them set up self-governmental organisations, all paid for by us. Well, we don't mind because they're our people, so we don't mind paying for them. But unfortunately, under this Indigenous rights here, all of the refugees coming into the country are going to be entitled to set up their own form of self-government according to their religious laws. And they're going to be operating outside of our English government system. And so that's all going to be financed by us. And so this is when it becomes no good for our non-Anglo people, which is the Indigenous people of our countries, because our non-Anglo people only number in the hundreds of thousands. There aren't many of them. So their children's children are going to be paying for all of these people that are able to get into our countries. They're going to be paying for that. And so they're going to be enslaved. All of us, Anglo and non-Anglo, are going to be enslaved to pay for the self-government of all the people coming to our countries. So what do they call the Chinese Uyghur or whatever if they all came to New Zealand, they would be entitled to set up their own governmental system, and it would all be paid for by us, and they can make their own laws, and they don't have to follow our laws. Well, this was an agreement that, why is the treaty so important? When we made the treaty, the agreement was that the New Zealand native Maori could have their own governance system. So that's why they've tagged all these people onto the New Zealand Maori to get this government system. That's what they've done. In Article 1 of the Indigenous Rights, you are signed up to the Charter of Nations, hundreds of pages, the Declaration of Human Rights, and the International Human Rights Law, which signs you up to refugee rights. And it signs you up to the International Bill of Rights and all of that. These are all called the Indigenous family. All right? And so, but it's quite funny because the bill is going to be to us. Here's our Anglo people. And here's our non-Anglo natives. Right, and then the bill to take care of the Indigenous family in their obligations as people to other people is going to go to them. So the bill's going here. And these are the rights. I've only picked a few, but I've picked some of the ones that are going to cost us a lot of money. Because here's the ones that cost us a lot of money. It's a long video. Any form of forced assimilation or integration. This means that you cannot order, when all the refugees come to our countries, we have to set up separate schools for them in their own language, not our language. We can't force them to enter into English-speaking schools. And that's why you're seeing Pacific Island schools being set up all over New Zealand, paid for by us, because of this. Any form of propaganda designed to incite ethnic discrimination, what this means is that they want to shut down your speech. So if you wanted to speak against all this money that you've got to pay, that would be considered illegal. And so you can't speak against them. Even if their custom infringes on our customs, we're not allowed to speak about it. Restitution, developed in conjunction with the Indigenous peoples, to respect to the religious and property taken without privacy. If it's in any violation of their laws or any violation of their traditions or any violation of their customs, must be paid restitution by the state, which is us. So they're going to have their own self-governance. So if you've got 200,000 Muslims living in your country, sorry to use the Muslims, but it could be Chinese or Samoan or anyone. I'm just going to use Muslims, no offense to you. If you've got 200,000 Muslims living in your country, remember that they've all got their own countries, but they're going to be able to set up their own little governance system outside of our government. And then we have to pay for all of that. And they're going to be allowed to set up their own schools in their languages, right? And any infringement on any of their rights that they've decided to make up themselves, then you, the people, the state, are going to have to pay for it. The diversity of cultures will be reflected in education and public information. So you Anglo and non-Anglo, we together Anglo and non-Anglo, remember that. You are going to have to pay for public information to promote their various groups. And you're going to have to pay for special education for their groups. So the state must provide education and information for each ethnic group. So you can have a Chinese group, you can have an Islander group, you can have a Maori group, and you can have everything except an Anglo group. You can't have an Anglo group. Why can't you have an Anglo group? Because we're all operating under this law, British law. We're all operating under there. So we can't have separate groups. But under their law, they can have separate groups and all paid for by us. So the states shall consult the Indigenous people to obtain. So if you want to make any laws in your state, you have to consult each ethnic group. You have to ask each ethnic group if the legislation that you want to implement or the administrative measures that you want to implement, if it's going to affect them. And if they say, no, I don't agree with that, then you can make laws for certain groups. So you might have you'll have your Muzi group here, and then you'll have your let's see, you have your Chinese group there, you'll have your Pacifica group there, then way down here you'll have your Jewish group here because they're a group all by themselves because they've got different laws. And then you're going to have your New Zealand Maori group here, or your Anglo Maori, and then you're going to have the state, which is all of the Anglos here. We're all going to pay, so if we want to make a law, we have to ask each one of these groups. And if some of these groups, this one will say, yeah, we will like that one, so we'll have that one. This one will say, no, we don't like that one, we're not having this one. This one will say, yeah, we're going to have this one. Can you imagine? It's going to cost billions and billions of dollars because remember, all of these groups have got leaders that must be paid for by the state. Indigenous people will have the right to be involved in the decisions, so they'll have a separate healthcare body, they'll have a separate housing body, they'll have a separate economics, they will get given. So state money, it will be when they divide up the state's money that's for all of us, your taxes, when they divide up your taxes, this group's going to get maybe, this group's going to get maybe 2 million, this group's going to get maybe 1 million, this is going to get 4 million, this group's going to get 2 million. The Maori, which aren't very many, they're only going to get 1 million because there's so few, because it's going to be done by number. And that's all going to come out of the state coffers, you see. And so then they will use that money for their own personal health institutions, their own personal housing institutions, their own personal, it's a fucking mess. The Indigenous people will have access to all financial and technical assistance to set all of this up. So it's going to be bad. We're about to finish up the video, and as you can see that we've all got a lot to learn and a lot to study. It's not over yet. Now New Zealand in October went for an entire month with no Governor General, and I don't know what that was about. I'm sure that a lot of laws were put through that we don't know about. But what we need to be looking at, and we need to understand Australia, Canada, England, we need to understand that since 1986, all our constitutions have been removed. And since, Australia and Canada did get a new constitution, but what they left England and New Zealand, both of us, constitutionless for all these years, 30 years. We have been without a constitution. And what they've sneakily, I don't know about Canada, but I know Australia, they've slipped Australia under New Zealand laws. And New Zealand laws are constitutionless, even if Australia are constitutional. New Zealand is not. So any reference to Australia into New Zealand laws means that you are being put under this constitutionless law, and they've tied you to the biggest one, which is this AI, and this AI law is where they have taken a Maori declaration called the Treaty that none of us signed up to, and this is a lawless customary document with no restraints or constitutions. And along with that, they use the word Aotearoa. That's why I'm saying to Australia, please do not use this word Aotearoa when referring to New Zealand. If you want to refer to New Zealand, call us New Zealand, which is bound to the Majesty's constitutional law. Aotearoa is bound to the customary non-constitutional law. And what they've put Australia into is this non-constitutional law over here that I just told you about previously, about the AI law, that the Australian government and New Zealand government have agreed to sign up to this together. And then under this law, Then they went and added on the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Rights. What they're doing is, Australia and Canada and England, is that they're moving between countries. They make a set of laws in one country and bind your country to it. And you don't even know that it's happened. And then they leave that country and jump over to the other country and make a bunch of laws there and bind the other countries to it. And then they jump over to the other country. So it can be, they're jumping between England, Canada, New Zealand and Australia and America too. I'm not sure how America fits into all this, but I just know Australia. And so in this case, they've put Australia into the New Zealand AI law. And in the New Zealand AI law, for the first time in the history of any of our countries, we are governed by a foreign power. And here is the foreign power that they've slipped into our domestic law through the lawless customary law of the New Zealand Maori. And then I want you to have a look what the future's got in store for all of us if we don't stop this from happening. This all comes under the digital www.digitalgovernment.new Zealand. The man that they're putting in charge of all of this now, Chris Farfoy, is a Samoan, and he is the person that signed off the Terrorist Act law in New Zealand, which bound New Zealand to thousands of United Nations terrorism laws and rights to refugees. Now, Chris Farfoy is not a New Zealander, and I don't even know why he said well, it's a bit of a long story. They changed our law in 2006 to allow foreigners to work in our parliament. Now, this nowhere else in the world allows foreigners to work in their parliament, but they did it in New Zealand, and they've given Chris Farfoy, he's not a lawyer, I'm telling you. He's not a lawyer, and he used to work in TV or something, and they've got this guy writing laws and signing off on laws for New Zealand and Australia. Australia, you've been dragged into this, as I've just told you. Now, this is what he is in the new AI law. In his statement from Chris Farfoy, this is what he says. We see a future where New Zealanders, but don't forget that they've added Australia into that, so we can put Australia too, because it's already going. Have a look. The bill, this is in a different bill. They've added Australia in another bill, so these are not the same bill. They're not the same documents, but they belong to the same family. And so the bill that's sitting in Parliament right now as we speak includes Australia. But this digital.government.new Zealand is kind of hidden, and it doesn't include Australia. So you won't even see it if you go there. But it says, we see a future for New Zealand and Australia. You won't need to know how the government is organised to receive services. Comply with their obligations. Here it is here. Comply, they're not saying that the government needs to comply to their obligations to you. They're saying that you are going to need to comply with the government's obligations. And what are the government's obligations? The thousands of laws that they have signed up to with the United Nations. So we're in a lot of trouble. Australia and New Zealand. Integrated or automated services will make it easier for people to interact with the government, providing, never mind that, but the integrated and automated, this means that you're no longer going to be allowed to see them. You will be able to contact them only through digital services. You can't hit them anymore. When you're angry with them, when you don't want to follow them, they're just going to cut off your money. They're going to, cut off your services, and you won't be able to do anything about it. And when you try to contact with them, you will be faced with some kind of, you know how bad it is now that you make a call and they say press 2, press 3, If you want to move to here, press 4. If you want to move to there, press 5, and you give up. That's what you're going to be faced with whenever you're not happy with any governmental organisation. So we've really got to step up. My final word to you, the answer is in the 1689 English Bill of Rights. Now, under the 1689 English Bill of Rights, foreign governance of us is forbidden. And the United Nations is a foreign governance body that is not constitutional. It means that they can make any laws that they like at any time that they like, and they don't have to ask you. But the main title of their law, they only put the title of their law into the domestic law, and that binds you to every single law that they make, but you have no power over it. So this is a serious, serious thing. But our saviour is the 1689 Bill of Rights. So Australia, you come under that. Anybody that's in the Commonwealth, we should be upholding our Commonwealth law, our majestic law, and get out of this United Nations monstrosity that they're creating for us.